Mr. Speaker.
Order.
Item 2, estimates for the financial year 1st April 2021 to 31st March 2022, Committee of Supply, second allotted day.
Head N, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Minister Vivian Balakrishnan.
Mr. Chairman, when I spoke at last year's COS, at that point in time, we had just repatriated 266 people from Wuhan, our own citizens. And this was just in the initial days of the COVID-19 pandemic. So 2020 has been a very busy year. At MFA, we undertook our largest ever consular operation in our history. Mr. Alex Yam would know that we worked round the clock and have brought back so far over 4,500 Singaporeans and their family members. And there were many challenges, but we were determined to ensure that we would leave no Singaporean behind. Around the world, flights were disrupted, borders were closed, public health situations were deteriorating, and we had an unprecedented number of requests for consular assistance. In some countries like India, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, we were able to mount repatriation flights to bring large groups home. But there were other places where Singaporeans were stuck in areas where we had no ground presence, no embassies. I am glad that members of this House have conveyed their appreciation to the men and women of MFA, all of whom, I want to emphasize, have remained unflinchingly at post overseas throughout this crisis, even as it worsened. Many of them are still separated from their family members after 1 year. More than 300 of our officers continue serving at our overseas missions. They fly our flag abroad, keep in touch with Singaporeans overseas, help those who wish to come home, provide support for those who choose to remain. They also work closely with our economic and health agencies to sustain our flows of food, medical supplies, and vaccines. They are part of the whole of government of Singapore. I should also say, although I will not reveal the numbers, that some of our MFA officers have been infected with COVID-19 whilst they were overseas at post. For privacy reasons and operational reasons, I hope you will not ask me for the numbers, but let me assure this House that fortunately all of them have recovered and are well. But again, this reflects our debt to them, their grit and their resilience and their commitment to duty in the face of a crisis. Our Foreign Service officers have worked over many years to build up diplomatic capital. And in the last 1 year, we have drawn down on this capital. For example, where we had no embassies, we reached out to our partners, including Malaysia, Japan, France, the UK, Israel, and Taiwan, to help bring our people home. Similarly, where we could, we also facilitated the return and the transit of other countries' nationals using either our aircraft or transiting through Changi Airport. Across the causeway, we've been working closely with the Malaysian authorities to help more than 350 Singaporeans who are elderly or minors or people with disability so that they could reunite with their families in Singapore throughout these border closures. Mr. Alex Yam had also asked how we help to ensure supply chain connectivity. In the early days of the crisis, when borders were closing, we worked with partners like Australia, Canada, Chile, New Zealand, and our fellow ASEAN countries to keep the supplies of essential goods flowing. And this was absolutely crucial in that time of disruption and upheaval. Let me give you one example. We established an air freight connectivity partnership with New Zealand, where flights transported food from New Zealand to Singapore and medical supplies from Singapore to New Zealand. Efforts over the years to enhance our presence at multilateral fora have also paid off. We have participated actively in the UN, at the WHO, and the WTO. And our networks were also key to securing our vaccine supply early and to minimize delays. But beyond shoring up our foundation in a time of crisis, we are also building up resilience for a post-COVID future. And in this shifting, uncertain, and volatile environment, strengthening our resilience is inextricably intertwined with increasing our relevance to the world. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's reminder to us to always seek relevance has never rung more true than today. Let me touch on 5 priorities. First, diversifying and deepening our trade relationships. COVID-19 amplified the push for shorter supply chains for greater efficiency and security. And many countries were stampeded into this. Nationalism, protectionism became politically attractive in many parts of the world, especially when there's fear and uncertainty. So, the fact that we were still able to sign the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership last year was an important boost for trade and economic integration, but also a statement and affirmation in itself of the importance of maintaining multilateral trade relationships. It reaffirmed the role of free trade for shared prosperity and peace. Both the RCEP and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, remain open. The door remains open for like-minded economies to join and as pathfinders to what we hope will ultimately be even wider agreements. For Singapore, I don't think I need to remind the House that trade remains 3 times our GDP. So this is not a debating point. Trade is our lifeblood. And sustaining international support for trade helps to bolster our economic growth as well as create jobs for Singaporeans. Second priority, to enhance our nexus for trade, shipping, finance, and data, and even more important, ideas. Throughout this crisis, Singapore has continued to be a transit hub for foreign nationals who needed desperately to get home, as well as for crew changes for the maritime industry, so that essential supplies and food and medication can continue to move across the globe. This is one reason why Ministry of Transport has been very busy. Changi Airport, our port, could never close. This is the other reason why you will continue to see from time to time, we will have cases apparently imported, because unlike other countries, complete isolation and shutdown is not a viable strategy for Singapore. Even now, we are facilitating Singapore's economic recovery by continuing to negotiate reciprocal green lanes and other safe travel arrangements. Although members of the House will also appreciate that green lanes bubbles will have to open and shut according to circumstances. We need flexibility. But the more important point is that we have continued to be a paragon of reliability, trustworthiness, that we have honored at all times the sanctity of contracts. We have never impounded supplies, even when the crisis was deep. The third priority is to promote multi-stakeholder partnerships. And COVID-19 has in fact shown that we can achieve new levels of partnership between government, civil society, and industry across borders when we are united around a common purpose. For example, we've seen unprecedented levels of international scientific and medical cooperation throughout this crisis. And let me give you an example. China's scientists actually published the genome of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in January last year, very early in the pandemic. Because they published it, and because Singapore also played a small but important role in curating and processing the genome, and in fact, subsequent massive amounts of data on the genomic database for COVID-19. Diagnostic tests were quickly developed all over the world, including in Singapore. And there has been effective cooperation across borders to share research and to develop tests, vaccines, and treatments. Ms. Tin Pei Ling asked how Singapore contributed to international efforts to fight COVID-19. Apart from our work on diagnostic kits, we were also amongst the first in the world to launch digital contact tracing solutions. And one of the first to develop a contact tracing protocol, which we then open source so that others could access it, use it, modify it. Singapore also played a key role in establishing the COVAX collective vaccine purchase mechanism. I believe several members, Ms. Sylvia Lim, Mr. Chong Ki-Hiong, have asked about this. We must start with the principle that fair and equitable access to vaccines across the globe is essential. This is not an ideological position. This is a practical proposition because no one is safe until everyone is safe. And this is especially so for a small, open country like Singapore. And no matter how well we control the pandemic within our borders, life cannot resume and get back to the status quo ante unless the rest of the world is also made safer. This is why Singapore was an early supporter of the COVAX facility, which seeks to harmonize public and private incentives for global vaccine development. We founded and we co-chaired the Friends of the COVAX Facility Group to provide impetus and support for the facility's development. It's very easy now to say, well, that's obvious, and why don't you do more? But we were put our hands up when it was not obvious and when everyone was focused internally. But under this COVAX mechanism, self-funded countries like Singapore will be allocated a certain small amount, but really what this facility does is to ensure that subsidized vaccines will be allocated to the other 92 low and lower middle income countries. So on this count, Singapore is a net donor. Make no doubts, have no doubts about that. Now, in a panic, in a crisis, it is actually quite natural for every country to look to secure supplies for themselves first. But we know that the virus knows no borders, and the COVAX primary value is in supporting wider access to vaccines. And without it, we would all be collectively worse off. In fact, members may or may not be aware that it was Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong who introduced the term vaccine multilateralism, which everyone bandies about now. He used it, and it has been in June last year, and it has been acknowledged by the WHO Director General, and it has entered the International Anti-COVID Lexicon. We also contributed US $5 million to COVAX to help low-income countries access vaccines through this facility. And our quantum took into account the needs of the larger international community and also our status as a tiny city-state, but a responsible and contributing member of the international community. The need for a multilateral approach to fight COVID-19 is therefore self-evident. And this virus, I repeat, does not discriminate across language, race, religion, or borders, and therefore it is in our collective interest to help each other. The fourth priority is climate change, and many members have referred to this. I'm pleased to report that even in the midst of the pandemic, many countries continued to push ahead with implementing their obligations under the Paris Agreement. China, South Korea, and Japan announced net zero targets, and we welcome the return of the US to the Paris Agreement. As a small island state, Singapore is disproportionately affected by climate change. But this is not a problem we can solve on our own. We must continue to work with the international community to operationalize in a real and practical way the Paris Agreement. For Singapore, MFA will work with the other ministries to do our part as a responsible member of the international community. We will seek new areas of cooperation in innovating to build greener, more livable cities. And because the world has now reached a point where more than half of humanity lives in cities, urban solutions that we generate in Singapore will have salience and will be relevant all over the world. And therefore, we will help sustain global momentum towards a more sustainable future. This brings me to the fifth area, digital cooperation, which I think Mr. Henry Kwek addressed. The digital revolution was actually well underway before the onset of COVID-19. But this pandemic actually acted as a stress test. It was a catalyst. It sped up our movement online, voluntarily or otherwise, and everyone had to rely on digital tools for work, for school, for purchases, for transactions. And to sustain growth and to help us move ahead in the digital economy, we need to develop common frameworks, common global standards to ensure that cross-border transactions and engagements and digital exchanges, including e-payments and data flows, are safe, secure, and efficient. This is why we concluded digital economy agreements with Australia, Chile, and New Zealand, and are exploring more with other partners. At home and abroad, we are also supporting capacity building. You know, DPM Heng put a lot into education and skills and training, and that's to make sure that Singaporeans will have the skills and the capacity to be at the forefront of this global revolution. At the UN, ASEAN and other platforms, we will continue to work with our partners to develop and strengthen the norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Here, you know, I'm referring to cyber security, which is, in fact, remains a clear and present danger for all of us, even more so now that we are so dependent on digital technologies. Making progress on these priorities that I've just outlined will not be easy, and the world will continue to feel the pandemic's after effects for several years to come. There will still be great geopolitical and macroeconomic risk for Singapore. I want to spend some time addressing this question of risk to Singapore. First, global debt is already rising at unprecedented levels in the post-financial crisis era. That was 2007, 2008. Now with COVID-19, you've seen a doubling, a trebling, probably a quadrupling of the global debt overhang. Governments have rolled out fiscal measures, loosened monetary measures. Corporations have borrowed to stay afloat during the pandemic. In the short term, these steps have helped to avert the worst economic consequences for the globe. But you know that these are ultimately not sustainable in the long run. And that means managing that transition will be a perilous journey for all of us, and especially for Singapore, because of the role that we play in the global economy. So that's one. The second is that the economic impact of COVID-19 has deepened fault lines all across the globe and led to divisions both within and between countries and societies. Politically, that is why we are witnessing growing friction and distrust rather than cooperation and confidence building. There has been increased pressure for governments to take a nationalistic, protectionist, isolationist approach. We've already seen this happen, whether it is the scramble for masks or PPE, or even now in the distribution of vaccines. The third risk that we are going to confront is that COVID-19 has in fact accelerated the pre-existing downward spiral of the US-China relations. Over the past year, we've witnessed sharp exchanges between senior figures on both sides. And this is deeply worrying. The US-China relationship remains the linchpin for geopolitical stability. But the fundamental shift in relations between the two superpowers preceded the outbreak of COVID-19. China is increasing its influence, asserting its place in the world. The younger generation in China, who've grown up in the last 40 years, have only known ascendancy, and they will not tolerate being treated or even perceive being treated unfairly by any foreign power. At the same time, and I tell you as a person who's had to travel frequently to the United States over the past 5 years, except for last year, now there is absolutely no doubt that there is bipartisan support in the US for a tougher stance against China to rectify what they believe are unfair practices, trade practices, as well as to deal with a contest, a competition with a strategic rival on a scale that the United States has never faced before. Even with the new Biden administration, it is unlikely that the measures and tariffs against China will be removed in the near future. Friction over trade, emerging technologies, human rights, defense, finance, and cybersecurity have all continued unabated. But I still believe, or perhaps you can say it is a hope, that the US and China will find ways to manage their relations. Practical cooperation is possible, especially if it is conducted within a rules-based multilateral system with established rules and norms of engagement. Some areas, in fact, COVID-19 is an example, which has starkly reminded the world of our interdependence. And it would have been far more effective if the US and China had been able to cooperate effectively from day one. Another area where you need effective cooperation with the two superpowers is climate change. And here I speak from personal experience. In 2015, as a ministerial facilitator for the negotiations that ultimately led to the Paris Agreement, I witnessed firsthand how effective cooperation between the US and China enabled us to achieve what would otherwise have been unattainable in 2015. President Biden and President Xi had their first official phone call recently. I'm sure it was carefully selected. The date was on the eve of Chinese New Year. It was a polite but firm conversation. They spoke about their respective concerns and differences, but they also discussed tackling COVID-19, the global health system, climate change, and countering proliferation. I think that's a good start, but without wishing away all the fundamental hurdles and obstacles and prickliness to their relationship. In our region, it is crucial for us to maintain ASEAN centrality amidst this greater geopolitical competition and uncertainty. We must continue strengthening ASEAN integration in concrete ways whether in public health, economic cooperation, or establishing protocols to prepare for safe reopening. And this will reinforce the concentric circles of an open and inclusive regional architecture, which includes mechanisms like the East Asia Summit and the Asian Regional Forum, and help hold ASEAN together, even as external forces try to push us or pull us one way or the other, as it will invariably happen. But ASEAN also has additional internal challenges. And Myanmar, unfortunately, is a case in point. The recent developments in Myanmar are a source of grave concern to Singapore and indeed to the larger ASEAN family. The immediate priority is to halt all acts of violence and the use of lethal force, and to step back from a rapidly deteriorating situation. Yesterday, I think you all know there was a significant escalation in violence across the cities in Myanmar. Security forces shot at civilians with live rounds, rubber bullets, stun grenades, and tear gas. Many deaths and injuries were caused. We are appalled by the use of lethal force against civilians. We express our heartfelt condolences to the families of those who have lost their lives, and we hope that the injured will recover quickly. We strongly reiterate that the use of lethal weapons against unarmed civilians is inexcusable in all circumstances. We call on the Myanmar military authorities to exercise the utmost restraint, to desist from the use of lethal force, and to take immediate steps to de-escalate the situation in order to prevent further bloodshed, violence, and death. Prolonged instability in Myanmar will have serious consequences for Myanmar, for ASEAN, and across our region. We therefore call on all parties in Myanmar to engage in discussions and to negotiate in good faith to pursue long-term, peaceful political solutions for them to achieve national reconciliation, including a path to find a way to get back to the path of democratic transition. And we believe this can only begin if President U Win Min and State Councillor and Foreign Minister Aung San Suu Kyi and the other political detainees are immediately released. Despite ASEAN's core principles of consensus and non-interference, ASEAN can still play a constructive role in facilitating, hopefully, a return to normalcy and stability in Myanmar. This was why Singapore strongly supported ASEAN's efforts from the start, including the ASEAN Chair's statement. We believe in engagement and dialogue in good faith with all relevant stakeholders. A special ASEAN foreign ministers meeting will be convened via video conference tomorrow, and where we will listen to the representative of the Myanmar military authorities. ASEAN will also work closely with all our external partners to foster an inclusive dialogue with all key stakeholders. And we must ensure that the mutually beneficial relations that ASEAN and our partners that have built up do not become paralyzed by this issue. If we can hold together and maintain ASEAN centrality, the longer-term prospects for our region are still robust. Now, in case people don't appreciate the use of the word centrality, it's not just jargon. You see, the choice for Southeast Asia is either we hang together, as what Mr. Rajaratnam said at our founding, or for us to become fragmented into battleground and proxy states and vassal states. So when we say centrality and integration, these are crucial for all the 10 members of Southeast Asia, all the more so when there's geopolitical instability. But if we can hold together, hang together, maintain centrality, then our longer-term prospects for our region, in fact, are bright. Despite the pandemic, consider the fundamentals of growth in our region. We have 650 million people. ASEAN has a growing middle class, and in fact will be one of the parts of the world in the next 20 years with the fastest growing middle class. We also have a rapidly expanding digital economy. It is no accident that we have a disproportionate number of unicorns here in Singapore, but not just in Singapore, but in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and expanding across ASEAN. We are also well placed to leverage the reconfiguration of supply chains that is occurring now in the world. Accelerated, no doubt, by COVID-19, but really fundamental trends that were already there beforehand. And so it is imperative that we press on with economic integration, fulfill the ASEAN community blueprints, and continue to expand cooperation with all of ASEAN's external partners in an inclusive way. Let me now turn more specifically to how Singapore will navigate the relationship between the US and China. We have a long-standing, strong relationship with the United States of America. It's a cooperation that is multifaceted. It includes vital areas: defense, security, economic, cybersecurity, people-to-people, education. And as the digital economy grows, we should all remember that the US is home to a vast pool of innovation, technology, and talent that they harvest from all over the world. Its companies in Silicon Valley and beyond are global champions. It remains at the forefront of developments in science and technology. American companies like Pfizer and Moderna have been trailblazers on vaccines and on treatments. American innovation and enterprise remain key engines for global growth. American companies will continue to lead the digital revolution. This is why I never count the Americans out. The cumulative stock of US FDI, foreign direct investment, in Southeast Asia stands at more than US $338 billion. The exact number is not so important. What is more important is that this sum is more than what the US has invested in India, Japan, South Korea, and China combined. Stop for a moment to think about that. The US has more invested in Southeast Asia than it has in India, China, Japan, and Korea combined. Every time I met President Trump, I reminded him of this statistic. And there is another factoid. Approximately 85% of the US total investments in Southeast Asia are in Singapore, which creates many good jobs here. So you understand then why our relationship with the US remains crucial. And the US military presence has underpinned peace and stability in our region for over half a century. I recently spoke with the newly appointed Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. Fortunately, both are old friends. I'm familiar with them, have known them in various incarnations before their current positions. We reaffirmed our excellent relationships and robust cooperation, and discussed doing more in areas like global health, cybersecurity, and the digital economy so that together we can better tackle the challenges of our generation. With China, we share a deep historical, cultural, linguistic legacy. We have a wide-ranging and important relationship, and I will get SMS Chee Hong Tat to speak more about that after this. But I want to highlight a few points. China remains our largest trading partner, and we are, almost surprisingly, we are China's largest foreign investor. We have 3 government-to-government projects: Suzhou Industrial Park, Tianjin Eco-City, Chongqing Connectivity Initiative, and all these have made commendable progress over the years. And you will know that DPM Heng just co-chaired the JCBC. Despite the pandemic, we have kept up our pace of cooperation and engagement with China. We sent medical equipment and supplies to each other at crucial stages of the crisis, respectively. For operational reasons, I can't go into details, but let me assure you, when the chips were down on either side, fortunately at different times, we stepped up and we helped. And that's how you build trust. That's how you prove that you're a reliable partner when the crisis breaks out and the chips are down. Therefore, you should not be surprised that China was the first country with which we established a reciprocal green lane, both because we had both been able to control the pandemic domestically, but also because of this large reservoir of trust. Politburo member Yang Jiechi visited Singapore last August, and I also met State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi during his transit in Singapore in October. And needless to say, I've been on the phone with him several times in the last year. Going forward, we will continue to strengthen existing collaboration with Singapore plugged into China's dual circulation strategy, and we will look for new opportunities and break new ground. So, given our deep friendship, our investments with both US and China, it is inevitable that we will feel the tug of great power competition from time to time. We must expect this. We must not be upset or panicked whenever we feel these tugs. In fact, I would say this is a design feature of the way we engage the 2 superpowers. It is normal for 2 superpowers to try to influence others into their way of thinking, particularly if we are considered to be important accounts, worth pushing and pulling. But I want to stress that it is normal, in fact, it is imperative for Singapore, or for any other country for that matter, to want to be able to choose for ourselves instead of being forced into making decisions by other people. In other words, not be forced into making invidious choices. So in navigating the 2 superpowers, we must continue to maintain a consistent and principled foreign policy. And for me, in simple terms, it means I say the same thing to Wang Yi as I say to Antony Blinken. I do not have the luxury of saying different things to both of them and then hoping they don't compare notes, but being consistent. Next, we exercise our sovereign rights, but with full respect for a rules-based multilateral world order and international law, and regardless of inducements or threats. Now, what that means is from time to time, we will have to say no to one or the other or both. And when that happens, and if you look back over the last 5 years, there have been incidents, we depend on the confidence and cohesion and unity of the Singaporean public and of members of this House across party lines to stick together. That's how we maintain our relevance and our strategic autonomy. And that is how we preserve our independence and our unique identity as a multiracial, multicultural city-state in the heart of Southeast Asia. By being relevant to both, and at the same time making it very clear to both of them that we will never be a stalking horse or a Trojan horse for the other. This same principle actually applies in our dealings with our closest neighbors, which I think Ms. Rachel Ong and others have asked about. With Malaysia, we've always sought a win-win approach in the many areas where we have common interests. I had previously spoken about how we had helped bring each other's citizens home. I told Hisham we tompang each other's transport. And we facilitated travel between our countries for those with urgent and compassionate needs, because so many of us have relatives across the causeway. We have coordinated well with Malaysia on our COVID-19 safeguards in order to minimize the disruptions to our companies, workers, and citizens, as well as the cross-border flow of goods and supplies. Foreign Minister Hisham Hussein is a good friend whom I've known for 2 decades now. We met at the causeway, but with the boundary separating us on July 26 last year to discuss our travel arrangements in the light of the border closures. Shortly after, we launched the reciprocal green lane, the periodic commuting arrangement on the 10th of August 2020 for essential work, business, and official travel. Given the resurgence of COVID-19 worldwide, including in Malaysia in recent months, we had to suspend the reciprocal green lane for 3 months from the 1st of February 2021, but we will review this after the suspension period. We will continue to work with Malaysia to gradually resume cross-border movement of people, but this will need to include mutually agreed public health protocols, preserve public health and the safety of our people, while taking into account the medical resources on both sides. I will continue to maintain regular communication with both Foreign Minister Hishamuddin and the Menteri Besar of Johor, Hasni Mohamad. We have managed to make progress on bilateral projects and issues. For example, we concluded negotiations to resume the Rapid Transit System Link project in July last year, and when completed, the RTS link will ease causeway congestion, improve connectivity, and foster more convenient people-to-people ties and generate shared economic and social benefits. Where we've had differences, we've also been able to manage them in a calm and rational way. For example, Malaysia allowed the Kuala Lumpur-Singapore high-speed rail bilateral agreement to be terminated on the 31st of December 2020 and has agreed to compensate Singapore for costs already incurred by Singapore in fulfilling our obligations under the HSR bilateral agreement in accordance with this agreement. We have been flexible in trying to work out an arrangement that was acceptable to both sides and had agreed to suspend the construction of the HSR project in September 2018. And then in May 2020, we agreed to extend the suspension period to the 31st of December 2020. However, and I think Minister Ong has explained to this House before, we could not accept Malaysia's latest HSR proposal as it constituted a fundamental departure from our prior agreement. Ultimately, whilst we seek cooperation with our neighbours, we must also always ensure that Singapore's long-term interests and rights are also protected. Still, it is good that both sides have been able to handle this amicably and will continue cooperation in other areas. In Malaysia, the movement control orders have also been implemented in the different states. Malaysia declared a state of emergency which will last until August 2021. The situation will remain fluid. Both pandemic and political situation will remain fluid, and we probably will see an election in Malaysia later this year. Regardless of the outcome, we continue to look for opportunities to work with Malaysia and to make progress where we can. On Indonesia, we continue to have a close and substantive partnership, and even more so during COVID-19. High-level exchanges have continued, including Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi's recent visit to Singapore. In fact, I've been in quite almost daily contact with her, either by phone or by WhatsApp message for quite some time. We will continue to work together towards a strong recovery. And areas for cooperation between Singapore and Indonesia include public health, economic growth, investments, financial cooperation, and safe travel. There has been progress on some of these areas, and I'll just give you a quick few examples. Prime Minister Lee and President Joko Widodo endorsed the renewal of our bilateral financial arrangement in 2020, which will help support monetary and financial stability in both our countries. We also launched an RGL with Indonesia in October 2020 to keep up business activities and people-to-people exchanges in a safe way. Whilst this reciprocal green lane is currently suspended, we look forward to working with Indonesia to resume this when both sides are ready to do so when the pandemic is under better control. We have also been providing medical supplies, including diagnostic test kits, PCR machines, and PPE to both the central and regional governments in Indonesia, as well as various non-government organizations. In addition, we have taken steps on outstanding bilateral issues. At the last Singapore-Indonesia Leaders Retreat, Prime Minister Lee and President Jokowi also welcomed our agreed framework for discussions, where military training and the flight information region will be discussed separately but concurrently. And I'm pleased that officials on both sides have continued discussions to move these issues forward. It speaks to the strength of our relationship that though the current situation may be challenging, we continue to look for ways to work constructively together. Mr. Chairman, as we look ahead, there is much uncertainty on the horizon, particularly the foreign horizon. The waters around us remain turbulent. There will continue to be unexpected currents, gales, typhoons, maybe even tsunamis that could potentially throw us off course. But the last year has showed that we have been, at least as far as Singapore Inc., as far as Singapore people and the ship of Singapore, we have demonstrated our resilience as a people, as a country. We've made sacrifices for each other. We've looked out for each other's well-being, safety. We've kept public health under control. And leaving no Singaporean behind anywhere in the world has been perhaps the best reminder about the value of citizenship, not just the red passport opening doors all over the rest of the world. So we have preserved our relevance. I think we've actually strengthened our reputation as a principled, reliable, and credible actor on the international stage. And this will put us in good stead going forward as we continue to pursue Singapore's long-term interests, always preserving our independence and our unique identity as a multiracial, multicultural city-state in the heart of Southeast Asia. This is our way of fulfilling the PM Heng's challenge of emerging stronger. We will emerge stronger in an uncertain world. Thank you.